Well, let me say again, because I've been doing this for a long time at Potomac, that it's good to see you folks again. If in this indirect way, I would hazard a guess that if a year from now you invite me back, there may be a possibility that we could actually do this again in person. We'll live in hope, at least for that possibility. This presentation this series of talks is a sequel to the talks I gave last year here at Potomac on the history of race relations, Black-white relations in American Presbyterianism. The sequel is designed to focus attention on a few key figures in the development of the Black Presbyterian experience in this country. I have to say, as somebody who I think knows some, maybe more than most folks about the history of American Presbyterianism, I knew very little about these people. And that's not a surprise, because when you look at the histories of American Presbyterianism written predictably by white people, these figures who are terribly important in the Black experience barely get a mention. It's kind of remarkable. So you can study church history and not hear about them very much. That's going to change, I think. These are important figures, and they help us to understand, I think, very well, something which probably most of us, I'm speaking here as a white person, most of us have very little knowledge of, and that's the matter of how Black Presbyterians thought not only about the faith, but about their situation in America. I'm going to be talking about three figures: Henry Highland Garnett, secondly, Francis Grimke, and thirdly, a person you might have heard of. I don't know, I'm guessing Emily has heard of this person, and that is Gay Wilmore. But those three are going to be my focus, each representing a different phase, a different period in the evolution of the Black experience in this country. First slavery, then segregation and Jim Crow, and then finally the battle against segregation in the middle decades of the 20th century. I will be sending to Emily and Stephanie a list this week of possible readings, just a one-page one, because some of you I have found in giving talks on this subject may be interested in following up on it, and there are writings available of these people online that as I think could be of interest to you. You'll be getting access to that this coming week. The man I want to talk about today, Henry Highland Garnett, is a big deal in American Black history. Let me say that again. He is a big deal in American Black history. If you can open up a standard college, university anthology on Black thought in America in the 19th century, you will have excerpts from the writings of Henry Highland Garnett. He was a very important public figure, less so as a church figure. Let me say that again. He was very important as a public figure, as an actor in the public struggle about slavery, less so in the church, even though he was a Presbyterian minister, a committed Christian, somebody who really viewed his entire life, his entire adult life in particular, as the working out of a Christian calling. I'm going to be talking a lot about politics in this presentation, and I want to stress to you that's simply a part of his life. He was a devoted Christian. He was, in some respects, a very conservative Christian. He was involved in pastoral ministry throughout his entire life. He preached hundreds and hundreds of sermons. But that which is, I think, rather, if you look at it, rather conventional, is not what is noteworthy about him, at least from the perspective I'm going to be approaching him today. The thing that's noteworthy about him is his public witness. I'm going to divide this presentation into a couple of parts. The first part, I'm going to talk briefly. I'm tempted as I give these talks to say more about their lives, but I want to get to their thoughts. So I'll briefly summarize his life at the beginning of the presentation. And then in the latter part, I'm going to give you some of the themes in his thought, in his speeches, in his writings, which will give you a sense of how he is a very, very prominent, very important figure in the Black world, thought about the issues of his day and how to confront them. I find on both counts, the story of his life and the story and the development of his thought, I find both fascinating, and I hope at least I can convey some of the what is really interesting about his life and thought to you today. You will be interested to know that he was born in Maryland and was born in 1815, lived the early years of his life in Maryland before escaping from slavery. He was born into slavery. And one of the things he says more than once over the course of his life, and it's such an interesting theme, is he says, one of the God's great blessings to me was that I always had an intact family. Let me stop and just pause and focus on that. I had an intact family. I had a mother and a father that I knew their names. I lived with them. They were loving and nurturing and cared for my siblings and me throughout all of our youth, childhood and youth. Now, why is that important? Well, if you know anything about slavery, you know that slavery had a terrible effect upon family life. It separated families. It broke families right at their core, rather deliberately, oftentimes rather perversely. So when you encounter somebody like Henry Highland Garnett, who says, I am so grateful to God for an intact family, the background to that is that he knows that so many other slaves had no such experience. This intact family escaped from slavery. And by the way, I don't know whether you know about the history of slavery in Maryland, but it's worth maybe devoting a couple of classes to it at some point. The history of slavery is that there was much more freedom for slaves in the period leading up to, from the time of the American founding, leading up to the Civil War, than there was in Virginia, for example, where I live. But still, there was plenty of slavery. There was plenty of slavery in Maryland. It was easier to escape from slavery in Maryland than it was in Virginia, but still it was a challenge. And he does refer to in his comments some of the about the process of escaping. He himself refers to something that would be today characterized as the Underground Railroad. The family escaped to Delaware in the 1820s and very quickly migrated north. This family with several children to New York City. And he then had an experience, I should say the family had an experience, which is the source of his becoming a Presbyterian. Another very interesting question to me is looking at these Blacks, Negroes as they're called a bit later, why were they Presbyterians? Why weren't they, for example, as most slaves eventually became, Baptists or Methodists? You know, the great growth of independent Black churches was among the Baptists and the Methodists, but some people who were Black migrated to the Presbyterian Church and Episcopal Church in particular. Very few Roman Catholics, by the way, still very few Roman Catholics who are Black. Overwhelmingly, the Black population has been and continues to be, insofar as it's Christian Protestant. Now, he has an experience in New York City, which, as I said, very much affects the religious life of the family. And that is, they migrate to a Black Presbyterian church. And that tells you something. There is a Black Presbyterian church in New York City in the 1820s. And this Black Presbyterian church has a kind of visionary pastor who is looking for young Black men in particular for to encourage them to seek the kind of education which will make it possible for them to become clergy. And he singles out Henry Highland Garnett for that, and he enrolls him. And by the way, he also enrolls he makes it possible for the parents to enroll not only Henry and his brothers, but also some sisters in the African Free School, which was founded by Presbyterians in New York City, the African Free School. And there they begin to get what he later characterizes as a classical liberal education. A classical liberal arts education really is what we're talking about. This is just, to me, fascinating and astonishing. He was getting in this African Free School, not just access to reading and writing, but he was on his way to getting a really good liberal arts education. And he flourished in education, and from there was sent to another school run by abolitionists, interestingly enough, in New Hampshire, and then finally finds his way over to a very important institution in the history of the struggle against slavery, and that is the Oneida Institute in New York State. Now, for those of you who are from New York, this may be familiar, but in upstate New York, there was a kind of concentration of abolitionists, a kind of meeting ground of Black and white abolitionists. It was one of their favorite places to gather. I'm not quite sure what the reason was. It could be that there was some safety in numbers. At any rate, they found something called the Oneida Institute, which is building on the kind of approach to education, the kind of attitude to education that the African Free School in New York City represented. And that is, and this is a very important part of the struggle against slavery in the United States, and that is the idea that Black men and women are just as capable for advanced learning, capable of absorbing well advanced learning as whites. Now, why is that so important? Well, because one of the fundamental premises of racism throughout this whole era is that Blacks are inferior, especially intellectually. So the abolitionist movement was dedicated to disproving that proposition. And with a figure like Henry Highland Garnett, it was disproved dramatically. He got what amounted to a college education at the Oneida Institute. By the way, the colleges, the big colleges and universities, or what were to become the large colleges and universities, were white institutions that were not accepting Blacks. The Oneida Institute becomes a kind of substitute. Let me just wander afield here for just a second and say the Oneida Institute was ultimately a source of what became Oberlin College, because a lot of these people migrated west into Ohio, into southern Ohio, into northern Ohio, and one of their principal achievements was the creation of Oberlin College, which in its founding in particular was just a hotbed of abolitionist thinking. He decided somewhere in his late teens that he did indeed have a call to the Christian ministry. But in order to become a Presbyterian minister, he could not just announce that he was going to become a Presbyterian minister. He had to have, of course, and this is another one of the defining features of not only the Presbyterian approach, but the whole Reformed approach. He had to be properly educated in all the things which are required in order to get a good theological education as it was understood by Presbyterians. And so, lacking the opportunity to go to a seminary, he was tutored by a Presbyterian pastor who was himself an abolitionist, and as a result of that, was unable to become ordained. He was ordained to the Christian ministry in 1539. That would have been at 24 years old. He promptly was called to a pastorate in Troy, New York, of a predominantly Black church. It's referred to in the writing on him as a predominantly Black church. And my guess is that what that means is that there were probably a few white members, even then. Keep in mind, this is well before the intense struggle over slavery that develops in the middle decades of the 19th century. By the time he assumed that pastorate, and he had a number of other pastorates, including one of the most famous pastorates of all for a number of these people, you're going to hear me referring to this church again and again. Here in Washington, D.C., we have one of the truly historic Black churches, and that is the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in D.C., which still exists. The 15th Street Presbyterian, which was a platform for Black Presbyterians to provide a voice for the Black, not only for the Black community locally, but even nationally. And eventually, by the time of the Civil War, he becomes the pastor of that church. But initially, he starts out in Troy, New York. By the time he had become a pastor, it was very clear that Henry Highland Garnett was an abolitionist. And I say that because he was actively associated with what by that time was a well-organized institution, the American Anti-Slavery Society, the one headed by William Lloyd Garrison, the famous one. He was associated with the abolitionist movement through the American Anti-Slavery Society. And he became, in turn, very well known. And this is kind of astonishing to me. He became very well known, not just locally, but increasingly regionally and then nationally as an important public speaker. And apparently he was just a gifted orator. And he had different styles. He had a sermonic style for his sermons, of course, but he was very much somebody who was on the lecture circuit at a time when somebody giving a public lecture could attract thousands of people, and he did. The thing that astonishes me about this is that he has been characterized as a competitor to Frederick Douglass in influence. Now, if you know anything about Black history, and by the way, this is a name that is worth everybody in the room reading a biography on, especially I'll refer you to David Blight, B-L-I-G-H-T, Yale historian who has a wonderful biography not long ago on Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is the great figure of the 19th century for Blacks. And Frederick Douglass was himself an extraordinarily gifted orator. But the fact that the Henry Highland Garnett was characterized by Blight and others as a kind of comparable figure with comparable influence is astonishing to me. I mean, here I am, a Presbyterian well along in my years, and I had never heard of Henry Highland Garnett until doing this work. And yet he was a man of comparable influence to the man who's commonly regarded as the great orator of the Black community, and indeed the whole American community in the 19th century. He was identified with the back to Garnett, he was identified with the American Anti-Slavery Society. He was also active for a while in something called the American Colonization Society, a very controversial organization, which responded to the challenge of slavery by saying, all right, when the slaves are freed, let's organize a passage back to Africa. That relieved the fears of many whites about what would happen if you actually abolished slavery. For a while, he was, contrary to many Black leaders, he was influential in the American Colonization Society. And he was also very active in the 1840s and early 1850s in the creation and development of something called the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party was a political party which was organized specifically to sort of promote the abolitionist cause. It was a predecessor to what became the Republican Party. I'm sure most of you know that the Republican Party emerges around the time of the intense struggle over slavery in the 1850s and 60s. This was a kind of preparation for what eventually was to become the Republican Party. And even though Henry Highland Garnett, I don't think it'd be appropriate to characterize him as a full-fledged Republican, he was certainly, for obvious reasons, very much on the Republican side in this era and very active politically in promoting Republican causes. Because of his skill as a speaker, he was promoted actively by the American Anti-Slavery Society and did a lot of public speaking all over the North, not the South, all over the North. He was a public speaker and became somebody who was actually, people knew about him in Europe, and he was encouraged to travel in Europe as a lecturer, was invited to lecture in Europe, and particularly in what we now know as the UK. He became a favorite lecturer among people who had, shall we say, liberal or strongly anti-slavery views, particularly in Scotland, where he became a favorite of the Church of Scotland and eventually raised a lot of money in Scotland through the Church of Scotland for the anti-slavery cause. So he traveled in Europe, spoke in Germany, France, various places. And his gifts as an orator were of indispensable value to the abolitionist cause in that respect. For a brief period in the 1850s, he, at the encouragement of the Church of Scotland, took up a missionary post in Jamaica. They had a particular interest in spreading the gospel in Jamaica. But he didn't stay there very long, and the reason he didn't stay there very long was because the Civil War was coming, and he sensed that was happening. Sort of the preparation, the political preparation for the Civil War was unfolding in the 1850s, and so he returns, accepting a call to become the pastor, as I said earlier, of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church. In the time of the Civil War itself, I'll come back and talk about his views about the Civil War in a moment, but in the time of the Civil War, he became very active, as he had been all along, but one of his particular causes was to promote, initially, they didn't use Black soldiers. Indeed, there was great opposition, even in the North, to the use of Black even in the North, only in the North, of course, to the use of Black soldiers. He strongly encouraged raising units that would be of Black enlisted men, encouraged that, promoted that. Eventually it happened. And then he promoted among Blacks enlistment in the service in order to help, as he would put it, defend the Union. As a result of that, and his interaction with particularly Republican political leaders in the 1860s, he became a rather important figure in American political life, and did something which, again, is just extraordinarily noteworthy. And why didn't I hear about this when I was first studying church history? It's just astonishing not to have heard it. He was the first Black man to address the United States Congress. First Black man to address the United States Congress in 1864. At the time of the beginning of the process leading to the passage of the 13th Amendment, he was asked, I'm sure, in part because of the interaction with Republican leaders that he'd already been involved in. He was asked to address the House of Representatives and speak on behalf of Black people. He was the voice, not Frederick Douglass, but he was the one who was chosen, and he was chosen, according to Blight, because of his eloquence. And the fascinating thing is, Frederick Douglass was known to be extraordinarily eloquent, so he must have been even more eloquent. It's kind of and he gave a very important address, the text of which is now available. We can get it online, and that'll be on that list that I provide for you next week. The title of that address, he was not given to anything other than strong statements. He was talking about slavery when he used this phrase. He said, the title of the address, and I'll come back and talk about its substance a little bit later, was "Let the Monster Perish." Let the monster perish. You can only imagine the stirring prose that followed in development of that idea. At any rate, he addressed the House of Representatives in 1864, the first Black man to be asked to do so. After the Civil War, he briefly was the president of a Black college, I should say a college created for Blacks in Pittsburgh called Avery College. But soon after that, in devoting his efforts to help along the process of Reconstruction, it appears became rather discouraged with the way in which Reconstruction was being thwarted and resisted in the South, and partly for that reason accepted an appointment by the president to become Consul General of the United States to Liberia. And it appears that the reason why he wanted that position was that he felt a certain need to get back to his roots in Africa. Get back, isn't that such an interesting theme? And by the way, that is a recurring theme when you look at the history of Black thought in this country, a sort of on the one hand and on the other, love of the American experience, even in the time of slavery, sort of admiration for American ideals, coupled with this feeling that our real home is over there across the ocean. He had some of that, and he, as a result, accepted this position, a governmental position, as what in effect would be ambassador to Liberia in the late 1870s. And he died in 1881. And he said, he is quoted as saying shortly before his death, "I will be buried on the soil of my forebears. I will be buried on the soil of my forebears. Now, what about his thought? The premise on which, at least the part of his thought that I'm going to be focusing these remarks today, is simply this. And by the way, this is one of the gains that you get from studying the lives of these people. It becomes very clear to you what they thought about the conditions in which they were living and the times in which they were living. All the way through his public statements, there is this idea. Slavery is an abomination in the eyes of God. Slavery is an abomination in the eyes of God. That was a controversial opinion in the 19th century. Let me say that again. That was a highly controversial opinion in the 19th century. Abolitionists were people who on the whole believed that in varying degrees of intensity. He was one who believed it with great intensity and preached this way and lectured this way. The premise of all of his work was slavery is an abomination in the eyes of God. It is contrary to everything Christians say about God's nature. Let me say that again. It is contrary to everything that Christians say about God. And when he got the opportunity, he would say to white clergy who disagreed with him on this, you just need to read your Bible. You just need to read your Bible well, and you will see that it is contrary to everything, or at least everything that is consequential that we say about God. And the Christian duty, in turn, he said over and over and over again, is this. The Christian duty is to get rid of this abomination, this terrible, sinful institution, as soon as possible. That's the premise. The question, which occupied his mind for decades. How? How do you do it? It's a well-established institution. Indeed, in the course of his lifetime, it became more solidified in American life. It was more controversial, but it was more solidified. Those of you who know about the history of slavery in this country know that it became more entrenched after the founding of the country as slavery became more and more an important economic institution, particularly for one part of the country, but not just that one part. And in turn created all kinds of complicated political dynamics, the effects of which to some extent we're still feeling. In an environment in which that was the case, the great issue for abolitionists, and by the way, you can see parallels in any very important political struggle. Think of environmentalism or some of the other causes that are occupying people's minds today. You know what's the advocate says, I know what the right thing is. I know that I know what the wrong thing is. I know the wrong thing has to be eliminated, but how? And typically, when you have a movement of any size, of any duration, you get debates about these questions. How are we going to do this? I mean, you just read our newspapers today to get a sense of what some of those debates are. Among the abolitionists, the people who identified themselves with the position that I've characterized as slavery is just wrong and we've got to get rid of it. Among those people, I would say that Garnett stood out for having the following stance. And this is my label, my characterization to put on him, but I think you will find it supported in his writings. He was a pragmatist with a radical edge. Let me say that again. He was a pragmatist with a radical edge. Meaning what? Well, let me start with the pragmatism. In that abolitionist movement, there were some very doctrinaire people, and doctrinaire about means as well as ends. For example, Garrison, the great leader, the great white leader, was a pacifist who was convinced that any use of violence, indeed any use of force in the pursuit of their objective was wrong. Highland Garnett disagreed with that and disagreed with it profoundly. There were other people who believed, for example, that sending people off to Africa, sending former slaves off to Africa once they were freed, was insulting to them. And so they were opposed to the idea of colonization. Again, Garnett was not totally unsympathetic to their concerns, but he said, in effect, let's use whatever means is necessary to achieve this objective. use moral suasion, use electoral politics. By the way, some of the people who were in the abolitionist movement were very anti-political in the sense of they were opposed to getting involved in electoral politics, which they thought was terribly kind of compromised, morally compromised. And those of us who study politics for a living can sympathize with that view. It's very easy to look upon politics as a kind of grubby business. Highland Garnett recognized that to be the case, and yet, by the way, he said even Lincoln is an example of, to some extent, the morally compromised quality of politics. Nonetheless, it is what we have been given, and we need to use political means as well. So there were all kinds of possible means. And Garnett was kind of pragmatic or eclectic in saying, let's campaign on all fronts. Let's use whatever tools are necessary to work towards this objective of getting rid of this monster, which is slavery. But as part of that pragmatism, here comes the radical edge. He refused to say that the use of force per se was wrong. He refused to say that the use of force, violence, was wrong. Indeed, he had the opposite view. And not only that, but he had a very controversial view, which Douglas resisted, and they fought over this. In a famous address that he gave in 1843, which really put him on the map. If you want to know when Henry Highland Garnett, this young man, frankly newly minted as a pastor, really gets the public's attention, it's an event which takes place in 1843 in Troy, New York, called the National Negro Convention. And by the way, all the way through the period of the 1840s into the 1850s, historians of the Black experience will recount these national conventions, which brought together Blacks, Black leaders, free Blacks, to talk about what needed to be done. And one of the most famous of those conventions was one that took place in 1843 in Troy, New York, where, of course, he was residing. And he was asked to give one of the major addresses, and he did. And he gave an address with the following title, which is this is the thing more than anything else, which is quoted again and again and again in anthologies of Black thought. It's entitled, "An Address to the Slaves of the United States." An address to the slaves of the United States, a call to rebellion. A call to rebellion. This was directly focused at the slave population, directly focused at them. And its central message was this: voluntary submission to slavery is a sin. Let me say that again. Voluntary submission to slavery is a sin. And he said, contrary to the gospel of submission, which I know people here, especially especially churches which are dominated by whites, or Black sermons to Blacks preach for Blacks by whites, contrary to the idea that submission to evil is a righteous thing. I say it's a sinful thing. I say it's a sinful thing. And it's very important that whenever possible, slaves resist however they can resist. And he said, I don't preclude the possibility of them rising up violently, shaking off this terrible curse. That was very controversial. But his position behind that was this premise. He said, I think this evil is so deeply rooted in the awareness and consciousness and way of life of some white people that it will be impossible to overturn without bloodshed. Let me say that again. It's so deeply rooted in the consciousness, in the way of life of some white people, that it will be impossible to overcome without some violence. Nat Turner was one of his heroes. John Brown was one of his heroes. So that'll give you a sense of, this is a Presbyterian pastor, a clergyman who's used to preaching the gospel all the time, saying, rise up, brothers and sisters, rise up, resist this thing, this terrible curse. When the Civil War came, he applauded it. He thought it was a tragic necessity. Wonderful phrase. It was a tragic necessity. And by the way, all along there had been people who had been saying, no, this thing can be overcome. Going all the way back to the time of the American founding. If you look at the views of the American founders, the founding fathers, as we call them now, who were sort of agonizing over the institution of slavery, including a figure like Jefferson who owned slaves, many of them said, look, this thing will, if we just allow it to, events to take their course, sooner or later, as the country develops, it will fade away. It will fade away. Well, Henry Highland Garnett was of the opinion, it's not going to fade away, it will remain there. So when the Civil War came, he applauded it. He said, it's about time. And his message to Lincoln, and he had some very interesting comments to Lincoln and tried to meet Lincoln, and Lincoln consistently resisted meeting with this man. You wonder why. He was never able to get that face-to-face meeting, but he was down there at 15th Street, just down the road, and you could well imagine Lincoln being at least aware of him, and maybe more aware than his biographers acknowledge. His message to Lincoln when the war broke out was this: it is essential that you prosecute this war aggressively. Please, Mr. Lincoln, do not compromise. And that was his great worry about Lincoln. That Lincoln would cut some kind of deal for the sake of the union, that would preserve the institution of slavery. He eventually applauded Lincoln for the actions that he took, but in the beginning he was very, very uncertain about Lincoln's commitment to what he thought was the necessary moral course of action. When he spoke to Congress in that famous address, "Let the monster perish," he said the following, and this is just a short summary of what I think is an eloquent statement. He said, I believe as a Christian that the true God, the God we worship, the God and Father of us all, is a God of mercy, but that God is also a God of justice. And part of my understanding of God's nature drawn from the Bible is this: divine retribution is coming for those who do evil. Divine retribution is coming for those who do evil, especially those who persist in evil and obstinately refuse to give it up. They, above all, will receive in due course retribution. And he said, the thing that is happening now before our eyes, the Civil War, is in part something which needs to be interpreted that way. The Civil War is, for all of its terrible cost, the terrible harm that it's doing to the lives of individuals and indeed to the nation as a whole, is part of the retribution that God is wreaking on this nation because of its inability to deal with this problem any other way. He said finally, I believe in the possibility of redemptive suffering. Indeed, I believe in the possibility of nations experiencing a new birth. And in the American case, he said, a new birth of freedom is possible through this experience of redemptive suffering, if indeed there is proper repentance, if there is proper repentance for this great evil that has been inflicted on the African part of our population. Those of you who are students of Lincoln's thought may hear echoes of that kind of argument in some of Lincoln's famous speeches, Gettysburg, Second Inaugural. There are clearly echoes of that kind of thinking, and some have even gone so far as to say that Lincoln may have been influenced by this address and the kind of thinking it reflected. Final thing I want to talk about is this. At several points in his career, he was asked, what do you want? And by the way, it has struck me, studying this whole topic, how occasionally, not always, but occasionally, white people will turn to, in the United States, will turn to the black population and say, sometimes with, I think, astonishing exasperation, what do you want? What is it that you're pushing for here? What exactly is it you want? Well, he heard that more than once in his lifetime. And his answer, in summary, is this. At one point, this is pretty much verbatim what he said. He said, first of all, we need to be treated fairly. He said, above all, we just want to be treated fairly. We want to be treated with the same rights that white people have, including the right to vote, which was a very important part of his understanding of what needed to happen if the problem of slavery, the problem of racism as revealed in slavery was to be overcome. He said, another way to put this is to say, we just want the same liberties, we want the same equality that white people enjoy in this country. We want the precious ideals of the American founding to be applied to us as well as to white people. He was a great respecter of the American founding in that regard. It's kind of interesting. There's a lot of commentary today about how the American founding was so deeply flawed because of its failure to come to terms with the institution of slavery. Well, he was a respecter of that founding insofar as the ideals that it articulated were of great, he thought, great value to not just to the black population, but to humanity generally. So the first thing is we want to be treated fairly. And keep in mind, running through all of this is a terrible white resistance to that idea because of the assumption that the blacks are inferior. Equality is a very controversial idea throughout the 19th century, and indeed to some extent beyond, because of a sort of pervasive white assumption that blacks don't deserve the same status as whites because blacks are just nature, they just by nature inferior. Second, in addition to being treated fairly, he said, we also want to be relieved. You can almost hear in his voice when he speaks this, the fatigue of it. We want to be relieved of the burden, of the hatred, which clearly we feel directed at us by much of the white population. Be relieved of the hatred, which is directed at us by so much of the white population. He didn't say that all whites exhibited the kind of hatred he was talking about here, but he said it's very widespread. It's very widespread that there's this kind of animosity toward us. And one of his great worries as the Civil War was unfolding was not so much worry, but concern was, can this underlying hatred of whites for blacks, can that possibly be rooted out? Third thing he said was, so the second thing was, we want to be relieved of the burden of this hatred that is constantly visited on us by so many whites. The third thing he said, and this is a recurring theme in black thought in the 19th century and on into the 20th century, indeed, I think into the 21st century, he said, we want justice, retributive justice. He didn't use the word retributive, but that's clearly what he had in mind. And what he had in mind was this. He said, a great harm has been done to us for generations by the imposition of slavery on us. This has been a terrible harm that's been done to us. And if there is any justice in this world, we need to be relieved not only of that harm, but also be repaid for the cost that has imposed upon us. In his last years, he devoted himself initially to the cause of Reconstruction, and then, as I said, soon left the country. And one of his biographers says that he left the country with a deep sadness because already in the very end of his life, he could see the emergence of what become Jim Crow ideas, Jim Crow policies, the black codes, instituting, if you will, in another form, the instruments of black exploitation, domination, by the white population. And he was deeply troubled by the fact that that was being accepted by much of the white population in the North as well as the South. And he said at the end of his life that the Black codes and all that they represent are just another manifestation of the deep intransigence of racial hatred. The deep intransigence of racial hatred. Like it just can't give up. It can't go away. The monster is still there. It can't somehow, we can't shake it. Last thing he said about this at the very end of his life was this: as he began to see compromises being made with between the federal government and the promoters of the Black codes and Jim Crow legislation and so forth in the South, he said, I have to say sadly that it appears to me that white people in the United States are more concerned about peace and tranquility among the members of their own race than they are about racial justice. They're more concerned about getting along with one another than they are about racial justice. Let me stop there. We've got at least 15 minutes, I think, for discussion. So let's get some questions.
Bruce, I'm from Troy, New York. Do you know the name of the church where he was pastor?
I do not, but I can find it for you. That's a very good question, and I know where to find that, but I just don't know it right off the top.
Thank you.
But let me just say more broadly. I coming into the study of this topic, I was not aware at all of how Troy and the area around that was so important to the abolitionist cause. It's a very interesting part of the story.
Bruce, since he was enslaved in Maryland about the same time that Harriet Tubman was doing her thing, did they ever cross paths? Did they ever have any contact with each other?
Wonderful question, to which, again, I don't have a good answer. But you know, my hunch is if that had been the case, somebody in writing about him would have said that. That's just too good a, you know, that would be a wonderful little vignette if you could, if it, the fact that occurred. So the fact that it has not been reported or found in any source that I've been able to discover is probably evidence that it didn't happen. Let me just say on that point, I think just for our own education, and it may be more than that, I think it's very useful. We're doing it in my church, and I would encourage it there in Potomac, to spend maybe a couple of sessions with somebody who really knows about the history of slavery in Maryland, to get a sense of sort of what the relevant history is. Because as I say, I think I know a lot about Presbyterian history, and most of this is new relatively new information to me. And my guess is when you have those facts, you'll be in a better position to understand a lot of things about your own state and its history and so forth.
Go ahead, Del.
Bruce, a question for you. You mentioned retributive justice in your remarks. Would you expand?
That was going to be my question. Did you hear, Del? You mentioned retributive justice in your remarks.
Yes.
Could you expand on that?
Well,
He doesn't see how retribution comes into concepts of justice.
yes. Well, it is a very important issue and a debated issue. But here's the logic of it. If a wrong has been done, part of making it right is as much as possible trying to provide compensation for the wrong that has been done. Especially when you think about relieving or eliminating the effects of the wrong as we move forward. And a very common way of thinking about this at the time of the Civil War and after was, well, if we've got this Black population who are enslaved, who have nothing, they have nothing in terms of economic resources, and most of them are illiterate, what do we do to rectify that situation? Well, one answer to that was provide them with sort of basic economic resources. I'm talking about the economic for the moment, economic resources that will enable them to begin to live and function as free men and women. 40 acres and a mule is the most obvious example of this. And by the way, that's what much of the Black population had been told and expected after the Civil War. You will get 40 acres and a mule, and the result is that you will be able to some extent, to begin to function as an independent farm. Well, of course, they didn't get that. And that's the next phase in the story. But and then as time moves along, the issue becomes more complicated. Other kinds of economic resources are brought into play. But initially, it had commonly, especially in abolitionist circles, that sort of simple meaning. They lack economic resources. They have been working this land after all. It's time to repay them for the denial of repayment proper payment for their services, for their labor. Here's one way to do it: we can expropriate land from the plantations and divide that up in such a way as to make possible for this Black population an economic basis for an independent life. The second thing that typically was added to that was, and we've got to open up free schools so as to make possible ongoing, expansive literacy campaigns. And when the government tended to, especially in the 1870s, to step back from that educational commitment, you will be interested to know and not surprised, the main institution that stepped into that void was the church. And especially Northern churches, which stepped into that with a kind of vengeance. I'll be talking about that next time, to provide educational opportunity for Blacks to complement the economic opportunity. And again, that's at a time when it's not taken for granted that free school is appropriate for the population. I don't know whether that clarifies.
If anybody watching via Zoom has questions, feel free to unmute yourself or ask your question in the chat.
Bruce, I was wondering if you spoke with the pastor at 15th Street at all as you were doing your research, Presavia Prelo, who I think is in her own right is a church historian. I was just sort of curious how
yes,
she...
I've had some conversations with her.
Yeah.
And I think, I will say, I think in this without, she was helpful. But I think as a generalization, I would say the importance of 15th Street in the Black experience, not just Black Presbyterian experience, but the Black American experience, is not well appreciated at all in this presbytery. My guess is the vast majority of clergy have not really much appreciation of that. By the way, there is a registry now of historic Black churches, and there are about 30 of them. You can look it up online. Churches that played an important role in the Black struggle at various phases, and 15th Street is one of them, one of the few Presbyterians. Most of these churches are either Methodist or Baptist from the independent Black denominations.
Mm-hmm.
But 15th Street is, and of course, 15th Street today is, what shall I say? It's not what it was once. It used to be. I'll talk more about this next time, but preview of coming attractions. The man who more than any other symbolizes the great significance and importance of and influence of 15th Street is Francis Grimke, who was the pastor there for a long, long time in the era of Jim Crow. And that church has been written about by people who are not church historians, but just historians of the Black experience, as one of the places that it was most common for what a famous sociologist has characterized as the Black bourgeoisie gathered for worship. The Black bourgeoisie, the people who were highly educated, the people who were of some means, and more often than not, those people were civil servants. Those people, there was a great sort of expansion of opportunity for Blacks in the civil service in the aftermath of the Civil War. And 15th Street blossomed in that period and became a place where very distinguished figures in the Black community worshiped. And just to complete that story, Frederick Douglass himself had 2 marriages. His second marriage was performed by Francis Grimke.
Okay.
That in itself speaks volumes.
Yeah. So is next week Francis Grimke?
Yes.
Okay. So that's a good segue into our next week's talk. Thank you so much.
How's that for timing?
It's excellent timing. Yeah, I was just looking at Bruce, thank you so much. Lots of good information, and we'll look forward to gathering with you and everyone together next week.
Have a good week.
You too.